Hello and welcome to tonight's live stream. My name is Kriss and I'll be your host. Tonight's event is part of the Festival of Debate Online, which is run by the not-for-profit social enterprise Opus Independence here in Sheffield. Now, the Festival of Debate Online is a platform co-created by communities to discuss the key economic, social and political issues of the day. All of our live streams are free, but if you'd like to donate to support the Festival of Debate, you can find a PayPal link on the stream description or on our website, festivalofdebate.com. Now, tonight's show is all about the environment. The COVID-19 pandemic has spread across the globe, resulting in unprecedented global cooperation and measures to battle its spread. Yet the climate crisis is still the biggest threat to humanity, and governments are still refusing to take the action that is required. I did a little bit of research and pulled out some particularly stark statistics, which I think is worth sort of reading. The global land and ocean surface temperature for January 2020 was the highest in the last 141 years, with temperatures averaging at 1.1 degrees centigrade above the 20th century average. Temperatures in the Arctic Circle most recently have hit an absolute all-time record of 38 degrees centigrade in parts of Siberia. And in the recent summer season in Australia, more than 20% of Australia's forests burned down. Now, tonight's live stream is about looking at potential solutions for a greener future. And it's also about looking at the social justice element of the climate crisis. I'd like to bring in our first guest for tonight's live stream. I'd like to bring in Rosh. Hi, Rosh. How are you?
Good, thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, climate change naturally intersects with a huge number of other issues, such as economic and racial inequality. And I just wanted to ask if you saw the climate crisis as much as a social justice issue as an environmental one.
Yeah, so the simple answer is obviously it's both. Until relatively recently, left movements, I think, have talked about climate justice as a nice to have, rather than it being fundamental to understanding how we need to reshape our societies and our economies. And broadly speaking, environmental movements haven't seen class as being fundamental to understanding who's responsible for the climate crisis. So there's a saying I like, I can't remember who said it. Environmentalism without class politics is gardening. And I think what that means is there are specific people, institutions, nations that are more responsible for the climate crisis than others. And those people, institutions, and nations tend to be the richest. And they consume and indulge in the most carbon intensive activities. So I think what we need to do, those of us in environmental movements, in left politics, in the climate justice movement, what we need to do in this particular moment is join the dots between all the movements pushing for justice. So Black Lives Matter are telling us that if you're black or brown, you're more likely to have a low income, have precarious work, be treated harshly or even killed by the criminal justice system, and you're more likely to die of COVID. And we need to expand that understanding to a global level. So Black and brown people around the world who have done the least to contribute to this crisis are going to be the ones who are worst affected. And not only that, global South countries are now places of resistance to the model of compound growth that global North economies are predicated on. Business as usual means ecosystems around the world are going to be desecrated to get to mineral resources and fossil fuels just to continue Western consumption patterns. So you can't have climate justice without racial justice, and we can't have the climate crisis without economic justice. And that's what's so exciting about the movement around the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal recognizes that the way you get everyone on board with the transformation we need to reshape our societies and our economies, and our economies work for too few people and they have racist outcomes, is we need to pinpoint those who have done the most to obstruct progress on climate justice and continue to benefit from the current model, namely the fossil fuel industry and the politicians who are wedded to an extractive growth model that is destroying ecosystems, and the people whose livelihoods rely on them all around the world. So yeah, all the pieces matter.
Absolutely. And ultimately, the COVID-19 crisis spread awareness of a huge number of issues, including inequality, social injustice, and also particularly access to green spaces at the moment, and the quality of air pollution. Do you think this is an opportunity to get people involved who haven't ordinarily been part of the environmental movement and bring them in to join this conversation?
Yeah, exactly. This is a perfect moment to start having those conversations and bringing in narratives that ordinarily aren't in the room. So we've all been affected by the pandemic and by lockdown, but not everyone has experienced lockdown in the same way. So the experience of lockdown has been classed and it's been racialized. So people who were told they were low skilled in the months before the lockdown, many of them who were black and brown, they've now been reframed as key workers and had to continue working in dangerous workplaces. And if you're working class, you're not going to have the same access to green space. A lot of green spaces in some of the most affluent areas of cities, you might not have a garden where you live. And again, if you're black and brown, you're more likely to be killed by COVID. And that's a reflection of the conditions that a lot of people live in this country. And what the COVID crisis allows us to do is join the dots between the different struggles. The environmental movement is often accused of being too white and too middle class. And part of the reason for this is we're not talking about how climate justice is salient to the material conditions of BAME people. So the Green New Deal goes some way towards correcting this. But one of the ways I've tried to talk about it is to make it salient to people from the diaspora. So I have friends and family in India, and they're already experiencing the effects of climate and ecological crisis. So in India, the average summer heats are becoming unbearable to work in. There have been droughts in the north and then floods in the south, and the monsoon has become erratic, and fresh water supply is threatened by the melting of glaciers. So the main reason I'm concerned about the climate crisis is because it's a death sentence for people in India if we don't do anything about it. And there'll be BAME people in this country who also have loved ones in the countries worst hit by the climate crisis. We need to enrich our movement with their narratives and their call for global justice. So global North countries have a historical and moral obligation to global South countries as the bulk of the emissions in our atmosphere have come from the countries which industrialized first. So not only do we need to do better explaining how the transformation of our societies need to meet the demands of climate change, we can't punish the poorest for it. So it should be paid for by those who've done the most to contribute, which is the richest individuals and organizations. And not only that, but more equal societies are less profligate and carbon intensive. The end of low income, precarious work will allow us to build more meaningful work in the green transition. So the Green New Deal offers a hopeful vision of more meaning, more purpose in people's lives, rather than a vision of personal austerity and frugality. And people need to know the transition is going to mean they aren't going to be materially worse off. So dealing with the inequality that's at the heart of our society is the only way we can win.
And in terms of, you mentioned telling narratives there, and looking at the stories that we're telling. I mean, what narratives do you think would be the most effective ones to bring more people into the environment movement? Do you think, as well as obviously, the very stark statistics we had earlier about the threat of the climate crisis, we also need, I suppose, these positive narratives potentially about a green and just and fair society. What do you think are the kind of most effective narratives that might help bring more people into this movement?
Well, we always got to be committed to the science, and we've got to be honest and truthful about it. But we've also, like I've been saying, join the dots. All the pieces matter, and whoever's watching this, I'm sure you're all involved in climate activism in many different ways, and whichever organization you're part of already, climate justice needs to be integral to it, because no one is going to be untouched by climate change. So in the climate movement, people talk about building a movement of movements. So we need to get migrant, asylum and refugee organizations on board. And there are great ones in Sheffield, like SciMag and Assistance, City of Sanctuary. But we also need to work with organisations that are building worker power, like the unions, and Acorn and Sheffield needs a pay rise. And there are those who are working through the parliamentary route, through the Green Party maybe, or Labour for a Green New Deal. Climate change has come kind of polarised in a partisan way. So like concern about climate change now seems to split on a left-right axis, but I think there's even ways to talk to conservatives about climate change. It's about the framing. So you can talk about it in terms of conserving natural heritage and identity. Whoever we speak to, we need to find the most salient way of making it meaningful to them. And we also need to join the dots with those fighting for racial justice, like in Black Lives Matter. So we've got direct action campaign groups like XR and school strikers who are amazing. And we need all of these movements and organizations. But we also need to be talking to each other about how none of us win unless we can all win. And the Green New Deal is a great way a vehicle for that. And these conversations are already happening in South Yorkshire specifically. There's massive potential for a just transition out of COVID for the city region, using the new powers of the city region mayor. But we need to act on that soon before it becomes greenwash. So however you're getting involved, and I'm sure many people watching here are already, you need to find a way it works for you. Not everyone can get arrested as in an XR action, but the important thing to remember is that none of these groups have a monopoly on truth. And since we urgently need a transformation of our economy and society, the time for tribalism has definitely passed. The changes are too fundamental to be owned by any one group or organisation. And I think a great strength of the climate movement is its capacity to learn and listen, especially to people on the front line of the crisis. And I think it's that humility and openness which is our great strength.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the this city region devolution deal, which was just recently announced, which has unlocked millions of pounds potentially for development in South Yorkshire. And Dan Jarvis has been a proponent of the Build Back Better movement. So we can hope that there might be some positive policies there. Thank you very much, Rosh. We'll be coming back to you again in the Q&A for the last section of tonight's live stream. So if anyone's got any particular questions or any comments or anything they'd like to add to this live stream or respond to anything that Rosh has said, please do paste it in the Facebook or YouTube comments, and we'll be responding to some of those in the last 15 minutes of the show. Thank you, Rosh. Now I'd like to introduce our second guest, who is Rachel Boyce, who's speaking on behalf of a Common Thread organisation. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Joe.
Thanks for joining us. Then we're going to talk about the fashion industry. Now, the fashion industry is responsible for approximately something around sort of 10% of annual global carbon emissions, more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. What are some of the things that make our fashion industry so unsustainable for the environment?
So there are lots of things, basically. One of the key kind of things that's happened, certainly in more recent history, is that we've moved from a fashion industry that had kind of seasonal changes. So they had like a spring and a summer, winter, autumn, kind of 4 changes of the stock. And we've moved to this new movement of the fast fashion industry, which it's called. And that's very much been based on the rise of like online retailers. So you're thinking about your Misguided, your Boohoo kind of ones, very much kind of focused on young people and very much around getting clothes delivered directly to your door as well, which has been kind of one of the key things that's grown in the fashion industry recently. And the fashion industry has massive impacts on the environment, right from the word go in terms of the materials it uses. So it's very easy to kind of think about the non-biodegradable kind of options that clothes can be made of. So a lot of them are made out of petroleum-based products. So a lot of kind of microplastics in products, especially like PVC kind of related clothing. But even like your kind of cotton, which has the positives of being like biodegradable and will eventually disappear in landfill, the amounts of water that cotton farms use are just enormous, and often those farms are taking water away and are in countries that are actually experiencing droughts, so taking it away from human consumption. And then you've got the kind of production side of it, where you've not only got the kind of environmental costs in terms of like dyes maybe going into the water system and things like that, but then you've got the social impact where workers are being exploited as well. Then while clothing is being used, you've got the microplastics from the washing machine. So this kind of been shown a lot more recently in terms of the Blue Planet kind of programs that have been on recently, and talking about all of the microplastics that are coming out of clothing from our washing machines and then ending up in the oceans, and then fish eating them, and then that coming back into the food cycle. And then you go on to like where you go into the secondhand level, where the amount of clothing that charity shops receive is so enormous that a lot of the time they can't actually use most of it, and some of it is either not suitable, or they just simply don't have the storage. So a lot of the time they will take a proportion of that amount and sell it off to third world countries. So then you've got like the transport of that, and also those countries are then having to deal with our waste, basically, of unwanted clothing. And clothing is so often non-biodegradable that it's staying in landfill for 200 years plus. And while it's in there, it's emitting greenhouse emissions and all of that. So yeah, it's not great for the environment, the fashion industry.
To say the least. Yeah, I mean, also, one thing that's been in the news very recently was in Pakistan, when some of the big clothes retailers have cancelled their orders. That it's left thousands and thousands of workers without work and destitute, and these companies often relying on insecure contracts, contracting for these workers. So the fashion industry, it's not just bad for the environment, it's compounded by all of those issues. It's also having an effect on the workers as well.
Yeah, very much in line with like what Rosh was saying in terms of how environmental justice goes hand in hand with social justice. Big companies that are wanting to make profit are very often exploiting the environment, but they're very often exploiting their workers as well. And that's been really highlighted recently with the kind of COVID pandemic, where a lot of and it was really in the news as well, a lot of the big brands like H&M decided to simply cancel their orders that they'd placed and not pay for a lot of their stock. And that's obviously put all of the burden on factories, a lot of them in like Bangladesh, where they've made the stock and now they suddenly have nowhere to go. And there has been campaigns, the Pay Up campaign, which has very much been trying to put pressure on brands around paying for that stock, and making sure that those workers were actually paid for the work they did in March, which many of them were not for quite a long period. But I think after some sustained pressure, most of them, I think about 80%, a recent report has come out, is now showing that they have been paid for their work in March.
Great. And obviously you do a bit of work and volunteer for an organisation called Common Thread. So I wonder if you tell us about, what can we do about some of these issues, and, tell us a little bit about the work that Common Thread do.
Yeah, so obviously, like as I described, the fashion industry has a lot of issues within it, but we all need clothes at the same time. And so the key, most important thing that we can do is just be satisfied with the clothes that we have at the moment. That is the biggest thing that we can do completely, is wear what's in your wardrobe and wear it for as long as possible. One of the key issues that the kind of fast fashion industry has created is around the especially in young people, the desire to not want to wear an outfit or an item of clothing again, and this kind of feeling that it's not cool, or it's just not the thing to do. And there's been reports where like a quarter of young people have said that they wouldn't wear an outfit that they wore for a special occasion. They wouldn't wear it again. So that piece of clothing that has taken months and months and months to create is worn for a few hours and then potentially gone in the bin. So the key thing that we can do is just wear the clothes we have and wear them for as long as we can. So whether that's repairing them if they get slightly broken, learning very basic kind of repair skills like resewing a button on, sewing a tiny hole, or if needed, going to like a seamstress or a tailor to get them altered if there's more work needed. But then obviously there's also buying secondhand, and the work that we do at Common Thread is all about clothes swaps. So rather than a charity shop, this is where people basically bring a bag of clothes that they no longer wear. So this could be, we have children's clothes as well, so it can often be to do with children getting bigger, obviously, and then needing more clothes. So they bring a bag, and then they pay £4 to come in. And this is pre-COVID times, and then they can take a bag away. And we like to think of it as kind of creating a bit more of a clothing library. And I've been involved in Common Thread probably about 4 or 5 years now. And I've seen items of clothing that I donated right back at the beginning come back and go out again, and come back and go out again. And that has significantly extended the lifetime of that garment. And that is like one of the best things that we can do in terms of reducing the impact of that one piece of garment, is extending its lifetime. And it's what we found also is that when we started creating monthly swaps, so we were having monthly events, was that it was also providing people with maybe just that little bit of a fix, that little bit of a boost of refreshing your wardrobe in a kind of sustainable way that meant you didn't feel the urge or the desire to have to go out and buy it from a shop. You could just wait for the next event and then pick something up there. And that was one of the really great things about the swaps. But obviously we've had to change a little bit recently.
Yeah, great. And I guess if people want to keep up to date with the work that you do or get involved with the clothes swaps, they can find you on sort of Facebook and Twitter and website.
Yeah, we're really active on Facebook, Common Thread Sheffield, and you can learn all about the different bits that we do there. And yeah, so we've recently started being active again after a period of being very quiet, and basically we always have a bit of a store of clothing after each swap, and basically we're enabling people to sign up, and they can register kind of what kind of things they'd like, what are they missing, what have they grown out of, and they can let us know. And then our volunteers, and Common Thread is entirely volunteer run. We have some amazing volunteers who work with us. And then the volunteers create a kind of a package of clothing, and then we're even starting to deliver to people's doors so that they can have that package and it be safe. And we advise obviously to wash the clothes immediately and all that kind of thing. So yeah, so that's been really nice to kickstart it again, and then hopefully we can have the swaps again soon, which will be nice.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you very much, Rachel. That was really interesting. Again, we'll invite you back for the Q&A section in the last 15 minutes of tonight's show. So thank you very much, Rachel. I'd now like to invite Leon in, who is from Sustainable Food Cities. Hi, Leon.
Hi, Joe. How you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, food is also a huge contributor to the climate crisis, with estimates of it being responsible for somewhere between 20 to 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how bad our current food systems are, and I guess just give us a bit of information about why they are so unsustainable.
I mean, it's great to have food on this agenda for this debate. Food very often isn't on the climate change agenda, even within climate change circles and activists. And yeah, it has a huge impact. 70% of the land in the UK is used for farming. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions from the food system and then a third of the food that we produce goes to waste. And intensive farming and fishing are the main drivers of biodiversity loss on land and sea. And the reason I think it's not often on the agenda is obviously not because it doesn't have an impact, is because it's too complex sometimes to deal with. It's a very complex system. It's a bit, it's more complex than, say, looking at transport or something like that. So it's good that it's on the agenda. But in a way, our food system does work for some people in some ways. We can go to the supermarket, up until quite recently, at any time and see a huge diversity of food, and it's there all the time. But it's not working environmentally. And I think it's the product of a couple of things. One is, I think, a quite reasonable fear of hunger, particularly after the Second World War. We started to increasingly industrialize our food system, and we've done that now for a long time, and it's become very industrialized to the extreme. And the other is just the nature of late capitalism, where we've always got to create increasing profits. Food's not like any other product. If you buy too many tellies, it'll hurt your pocket, but it's not going to hurt much else. If you have too much food, it's one of those things, food, that if you overconsume it or underconsume it, it'll damage your health or even kill you. But at the same time, the food industry has to continually compete with itself and create more food. So it is incentivized to get us to have more calories and more processed food. So it has a huge impact. I think we've lost sight of what a food system should be, which is to feed people well. And the impact on the environment is from farm or before farm. It's from the inputs that go into farming right through to when we eat it, right through to the waste. Every part of the food system can have a huge impact on the environment. I mean, a couple of examples would be, the feedlots in America, where you get the really cheap beef. They have slurries of waste, often with a lot of antibiotics in them, just rivers coming out of those that go straight into the water system. That's a good example. I mean, other crazy things, like if you buy a lot of farmed fish, it is fed on other fish that is dredged from the sea. So there's some really crazy stuff out there that has a huge impact on the food system, on the environmental system as well.
Great. I mean, obviously you're really involved in sustainable food networks. I wonder, could you give us a bit more information about what a sustainable food network would look like? I guess particularly on a kind of local or regional level.
Yeah. So we've changed our name, so we're now Sustainable Food Places. Because we started to bring on other places other than cities. And what we encourage places to do is to have a food partnership. So people coming together across sectors, from business, from the local authority, from the NHS, from the community sector, and try and tackle some of their local food issues, but do so by looking at the whole food system. So not be a single issue partnership. So they're not just looking at food poverty, but they'll be looking at procurement, at health, at business, good food movements, food access, all those things together. And the idea is, at its most simplest, is that if people come together to talk about food, then they can create additionality that wouldn't happen if they hadn't come together. So it's about collaboration, because food very rarely has a home in the local authority or anywhere. So if you want to talk about sustainable food, where do you go? It's very often sidelined. So it's really about people, organisations coming together to tackle issues within their food system. And we've got a food partnership in Sheffield. So I work nationally, but I live in Sheffield. So I'm also part of our local food partnership called Chef Food. So anybody is encouraged to get in touch, support us. We've got a great website. And it really is about what can we do together to tackle issues around food, including climate change, that if we hadn't come together, we wouldn't be able to tackle.
Yeah, great. And there are some other great local organisations involved in that food partnership, such as Regather, who've got a great, excellent local veg box scheme, and obviously Food Hall as well, who've been instrumental in providing cooked meals as well for members of households that haven't been able to, are shielding and haven't been able to leave. Couple more questions before we move on. In terms of, I guess, individual choices, there's been a huge growth in people being vegetarian and vegan. What do you think? Are there sustainable ways of eating meat, or do you think we all need to stop eating meat entirely?
This is a very contentious area. It always raises the temperature in any debate and in any forum. There are entrenched camps on both sides. I can sort of characterise them. This came to a head in the Oxford Real Farming Conference last year. So you've got what I will call the Joanna Blythman position, who's a food journalist, who I think is great and respect her. But she has taken a position where she sees that any call for reducing meat is an attack on farming, is an attack on sort of human personal rights, and so on. And then in the other camp, you've got someone like George Monbiot, who deliberately, I think, is provocative and says things like, we need to kill all the cows. So both of these positions are unrealistic, really. Lots of people are choosing vegetarianism and increasingly veganism, but people will still eat meat. It's not going to go away. Our position as an organisation, nationally, Sustainable Food Places, is of the less but better camp. So that the meat that we eat has less impact on the environment, has higher welfare standards, and we eat less of it. Because it is the single thing that can happen that will reduce food's impact on the environment, is to reduce meat consumption and production. But it's not realistic, I don't think, to say we all need to go vegan, but it's also not realistic to pretend it's not happening. There's a really good book by Colin Tudge, who's a food writer, who wrote a book called Feeding People is Easy. And he took some of you might have seen it, the description the NHS will give of what a healthy diet looks like, the Eat Well plate. So you've got mostly vegetables and pulses in a big section of it. You've got a little bit of fat, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of meat. And he took that, and then that is also what would have a very positive impact on the environment. It's also what's good for health. It also turns out that is what most traditional diets look like. And it's also what more sustainable farming would look like. That is what an average side mixed farm would look like. It would have a couple of cows, a couple of chickens, lots of vegetables. So I think we do need to reduce meat. I think we need to take the heat out of the debate and try and find a way forward to be able to reduce meat without people shouting at each other. Is my opinion, and it's also the sort of position of Sustainable Food Places.
Great, thank you, Leon. So again, if you've got any comments or questions, please do post them either on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll be coming back to you a little bit later on, Leon, as well, for the Q&A. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'd like to bring in our next guest, Harry, who's from the official cross-party campaign, Green New Deal UK. Hi, Harry.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I just wanted, could you give us a quick, broad outline of the Green New Deal and what it would look like for communities?
Yeah, Anne Pettifor, who's an economist who works in the Green New Deal, has a really good, useful phrase for thinking about it, where she says the Green New Deal is a plan, not an idea or a proposal, but a comprehensive plan for stemming the breakdown of Earth's life support systems. And that's really useful because it's this idea of really intentionally thinking and restructuring society in the middle of a crisis in a transformative way. The Green New Deal is in part inspired by the New Deal of America in the 1930s, but in a sense, it's much more ambitious, and it fundamentally aims to restructure and rebuild the economy in a way that protects the planet and people. At Green New Deal UK, we kind of see 5 principles of a Green New Deal as key to that. Firstly, it's got to totally decarbonize the economy. That's pretty straightforward. Secondly, in doing that, it's going to create well-paid, secure and unionized jobs across the country. Thirdly, it's also going to transform the economy so it works for everyone. And that means greater democratic participation, greater accountability and common ownership of resources. It's additionally, the Green New Deal protects and restores habitats and carbon sinks and ensures the provision of a healthy environment, clean air and water to everyone. And then finally, this idea of the Green New Deal promoting global justice and being externally facing, and particularly accounting for the kinds of things that Rosh was talking about in sort of the UK's historic omissions and its debts in regard to colonialism. And that's a big idea, right? So part of the task of us at Green New Deal UK is telling that story locally and kind of nailing it down for people who want to really get used to this idea. So it might be at local, it might be the concern for the lack of jobs, the loss of green spaces, adaptation to flooding, which is a big issue in South Yorkshire. But that's our key role, is to take this big idea of the Green New Deal, the transformation of society, and really ground it for the community.
Great. And how have you been, obviously it's a cross-party campaign. I just wondered if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you've been, approaching campaigning on this issue, and how you've been trying to sort of bring communities with you into this process.
Yeah, I mean, the way we work at Green New Deal UK is this process of local hubs, we call them, and we work on creating this network of local hubs campaigning for the Green New Deal across the country. There are always folk who are interested in organising for environmental causes wherever you go in the UK, worldwide, right? But when you go to the sort of towns and cities in the UK, sometimes you get this impression that there's like 30, 40 folk who are all organising around the environment in the same different groups. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to make what we call a braver space. And what does that mean? It means that when we're talking about this vision of a Green New Deal locally, it's only a real vision of the community when the marginalised in that community are able to participate in the design and the thinking around it. And in particular, the movement for a Green New Deal only really works when it brings together this broad coalition, this movement of folks traditionally excluded and disengaged from existing environmental movements. And so far, that's been going okay. There's still loads of work to do, and it's not easy, certainly trying to build traditional solidarity, but there's a lot of positive conversations and actions that we're doing as Green New Deal UK, and in particular through the Build Back Better campaign that we lead. We're working a lot with doctors and nurses and trying to link together the crisis in healthcare we currently have with the climate crisis that we have, and trying to build together those two movements who've been really proactive in the last few years in the UK, and building this new sort of idea of what environmentalism is going to look like in the 2020s, right?
Great. And obviously in the last few days, well, on Tuesday, Boris Johnson announced a new economic stimulus package and drew some comparisons to the New Deal, and Rishi Sunak as well has been talking about a green industrial revolution. How far do you think these measures will go towards achieving some of the aims for the Green New Deal? Yeah,
I mean, in the past decade, we've kind of been here before with environmental policy. We had Cameron claiming he was going to be the greenest government ever. We had Theresa May changing the net zero target to 2050. And we've got Boris Johnson now claiming the New Deal. What unifies all of those is that when you actually look at the substance of the proposals and what is being done to tackle climate change and social justice issues, it falls apart. It's not a New Deal. It's not at all within the line of those historic policies or within the proposal for a Green New Deal, right? If we were to compare it to what was done in America in the 30s, it's 1/200th of the size of the investment that's being done. And we aim to be more ambitious than the New Deal of the 30s, right? It's less than the Royal Navy spent on 2 aircraft carriers recently. And there's loads of ways you can go into this. The New Deal that the government is claiming creates 3,000 new jobs in conservation, but that's only 5 per constituency in the UK. It's kind of like putting a potted plant in a house with a broken foundation and a leaky roof. More needs to be done to make us a greener, fairer, healthier society coming out of this crisis, and this is just nowhere near enough. So yeah, it's welcome that the government is interested in stimulus responses, but it's just not good enough.
And just one last question before we go to the Q&A and bring everyone back in. I mean, obviously for people watching this at home, there might be individuals, they might be part of organisations, they might be part of companies that want to sort of get involved in the Green New Deal. What's your kind of call to action? How can they get involved in your campaign?
Yeah, so I mean, in Sheffield in South Yorkshire, we're setting up a Green New Deal hub. And then we also have the national team that people can volunteer with, or if you're in an area that doesn't have a local hub yet, we will help you create this local hub of people talking about and campaigning for a Green New Deal.
Ooh. Harry, I think we might have lost you just then. Perhaps we will be able to bring Harry back a little bit later on, but it kind of segues fairly neatly into the Q&A section. So I'd like to bring back some of our guests from earlier as well, bring back Rachel, Leon and Rosh. Thank you for joining us again. I'm going to bring in a question from Helen Francis, which I think will ask everyone to respond to, which is, are we missing a gap journey step before climate group involvement? Thinking of communication and engagement strategies, how can we engage people who have a fixed mindset? Is it that we make it locally relevant to them? Also using a twofold approach, for example, if you do this in your home, you can save money, but also the environment. Maybe I'll ask Rosh first to potentially respond to that, if that's all right.
That's a great and a difficult question. I guess I would say, if being involved in climate activism doesn't necessitate you be in a climate organization or a group. So you don't, to be concerned about climate, you don't necessarily have to be an XR or be a school striker or whatever else. I mean, the most effective way to get the change you want is to be collectively organized. That's undoubtedly true. But we also have to think about what often movement spaces like activist circles are full of people who have the means and the resources and the time to be there. So there's often a lot of people who aren't in those spaces, whose voices we don't hear, and who aren't part of those conversations. I'm concerned about getting those people in the room, not necessarily trying to convince people who do have a fixed mindset. There's some people we're not going to be able to convince. Some people are ideologically opposed to any climate action, and there might be little we can do about that. But there are plenty of people who we can persuade with narratives and arguments that are salient to them to help get them on board with collective action. So I think we need to think about the people who aren't in the room, and we need to think about tailoring our narratives and our stories to get people into the room by speaking to them in a meaningful way.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I'll probably, thank you, welcome back, Harry. I wondered if, Harry, did you hear that question? Because I think might have an interesting response to it as well, which is about how we can engage people who've got, I suppose, a fixed mindset. I'm wondering, when you talked about narratives earlier, about developing narratives, and maybe you might need to bring in elements of micro-targeting to apply to, potentially different audiences who might respond better to different messages. I just, wondered whether you had any sort of reflections on that, Harry.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that the environmental movement approaches with a sense of humility. I think there's a big issue where people come in and they assume they have all the answers and they can communicate in the best way about the climate crisis. And whilst I agree that there are definitely people who deny climate change is happening outright or are directly obstructionist, and it's not actually worth our time as a movement engaging with them, there are a lot of people who you really need to sit and listen as a movement and have a session with them and understand their values and where they're coming from. And then it's a matter of grounding sort of transformative change in their vision of what a transformation looks like and what they care about. And for me, that might be better Wi-Fi,
Yeah, excellent. I'll go to another comment now. This one's from James, who was talking about we must find systemic rather than individualistic approaches to solving this problem. And I suppose I'll maybe start off with you, Rachel, in response to that. So, I guess, the comment there is that, obviously we need complete far-reaching solutions to, things like fashion, as well as, supporting the great work that you're doing in terms of individual choice. And,
I don't think it's one or the other, to be honest. I think both are needed. Certainly, I think in the last few years, the government have commissioned a couple of reports about the fashion industry and changes that should be made. And they've said X, Y, and Z, and they've done maybe half of one. So there's lots of things like that systematically we could do in terms of things like thinking about where we send our waste as a country is a really big one, and not just dumping it on poorer countries to deal with. And textile waste is a big one, but also household waste as well. And they're things that an individual has like very little control over, particularly, especially if you think about things like recycling as well. But I think also things like, and thinking about the last comment in terms of communication, things like Blue Planet and the way you frame things and the way you talk to people differently about these issues can create like big changes in behavior from individuals, and collectively that does have an impact. And those things can make a big difference. And for example, the Pay Up campaign was very much led by individuals and pressure on social media, and that had massive impact in terms of making sure that those workers were paid for the work. And I don't know what's going to happen to the stock, whether that gets used or whether it gets dumped. I don't know. That's another question. But
great. I mean, bringing you in, Leon, here. I mean, fundamentally, is the problem, capitalism? Is it our economic system? And I just wondered how you feel about how you organise sort of within that. Do you see yourself as a sort of a self-organising pocket that operates slightly outside of, but also within capitalism? I just wondered how, you feel these, the food networks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hate individualising any of these issues anyway. So we are very much about systems change, and we organise. We have to lobby. We have to work with government, both local and national, because that's where the changes will be made at systems level. So, for instance, even a small portion of the £500 million a year NHS food budget, if that was spent on more sustainable food, then the world would be a better place. So, yeah, I'm very wary of individualizing these things. I mean, I think choice editing people's choices to some extent is fair enough. People say that, well, every bite that you take votes for a good or a bad food system, but why is the bad food system on the table at all? So, yeah, where do we sit as local food partnerships? I'd say we are sort of critical friends of different organisations. So we want to see a systems change, but we need to be able to speak truth to power when things don't go the way that they should. But at the same time, we have to keep some independence as well. So it's a bit of a balance, actually, Chris.
Thank you, Leon. We'll go to another comment that's in, which rather sort of meta-narrative style. It's probably from one of my colleagues because it's under the Festival of Debate, as it will pop up. It's not a question I've written myself. But a comment that says, I've not seen much evidence of consumers leading anything. It's a passive term, isn't it? Consumer citizens perhaps could be more effective. Ultimately, though, the responsibility of leadership on averting climate disaster surely shouldn't be beholden on consumers. It should be about forming consensus and then lobbying or making changes to individual behaviours, patterns, framed as they are by a range of different socioeconomic components. I suppose in some ways the comments are unpacking a little bit more what we were talking about there. Maybe let's come back to you, Rosh, on this question about yeah, are we putting too much onus on consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely support people engaging in lifestyle change, because that's important. It's important to live your values, but we need to understand where power lies in our society. So most flights are taken by a small proportion of people. Most emissions are emitted by 200 companies. So when we just look at power generation, the fossil fuel companies knew how climate change would pan out, and they obstructed the truth on the science. There are vested interests that are deeply implicated in ensuring there is no action on climate change at political level, and they've obstructed it every step of the way. And the only way you can defeat that kind of vested interest is with the collective power of people in their workplaces, in their unions, in political parties that actually understand the urgency of the problem. And the problem is deeply urgent. We are very far away from avoiding the worst effects of climate change. We're well on track to the worst effects. So we can't rely on the virtuousness of individuals to make this change. We need deep structural change in what the purpose of our economy is, what our industrial strategy is, how we use the land. So many deep questions we need to grapple with, and for that to happen, there needs to be real democracy. There needs to be real collective power.
Great. So you've got probably only about sort of a couple of minutes left. So maybe I thought I'd just return to you quickly in turn, and maybe if you want to just come up with a quick call to action, or tell people again how they might sort of engage with your campaign. Maybe let's go to you, Harry, next.
Yeah, I mean, each year we wait to tackle the climate crisis is a year the solution needs to get even more ambitious. And I think the Green New Deal is the key moment and the key plan at the moment to deal with these crises. The best way to sort of get stuck in is to check out Green New Deal UK and the Build Back Better campaign, which we lead on, both of which we think are going to be crucial in the coming months.
Great, thank you, Harry. And go to you next, Rachel.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in finding out more about what I was talking about, so it's Common Thread Sheffield on Facebook, so you can see all the details there. And also on social media, I'd recommend Fashion Revolution, who share like a really great details about how we can improve the fashion industry, both environmentally and for social justice purposes. And kind of going back to the previous point about individuals and whether they need to join campaign groups or do something else as well. Like for me personally, I think it's important to engage people on things they're interested in, things they're passionate about, and looking at alternatives of those things. And those things can be more environmentally beneficial as well. And providing those alternatives is really important for people, and having different avenues for people to engage in this kind of topic.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And finally, we'll go to you then, Leon.
Think about what you're eating. It's the only thing you'll consume that will become part of you. If you're in the UK, go to our website, Sustainable Food Places, and if there is a food partnership in your place, think about connecting with them. If there isn't, think about starting one.
Great. Roche, any other final comments before we round up?
I think Harry said it well. I think the Green New Deal is the big picture structural change we need to actually deal with the urgency of the problem. So I urge everyone to get involved with that.
Great. Thank you very much, Roche. Thank you, Rachel, Harry and Leon, for all joining us. And thank you all for watching at home. If you'd like to donate to support the work we do here at the Festival of Debate, that'd be very much appreciated. As I'm sure you're aware, it's a very difficult time for arts and cultural organisations in general. You can do so via the PayPal link on Facebook or YouTube, or via our website, festivalofdebate.com. And likewise, you can watch all of our previous live streams on the web there. Thank you very much for joining us. Cheers. Good night.